I'm going to hand over now to Jim Watson. Jim is the Research Director of UKirk, and Jim is going to chair and introduce our speaker for this evening. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Rob, and welcome everybody from me. I hope you can hear me okay. So we're really pleased that this is the first, hopefully, of a series of lectures and events we'll organise with Imperial College, with the Energy Futures Lab. As Rob says, we've been headquartered there for quite some time, nearly 10 years now, but I think we'd like to develop that relationship a little bit further. So we're very pleased we've got Charles Hendry, our speaker today, to kick this off. I think it's going to set the bar quite high for the lectures and events we hope will follow. So just really briefly to introduce Charles before he gives his talk, and there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. Charles is the MP for Wealden, which is not too far from where I live in Brighton, so it's a Sussex constituency, and really well known as one of the members of Parliament who's a real expert in the energy field. So you sometimes get ministers travelling through government, spending a bit of time on this and that, but I think when Charles was a minister, we really felt that there was somebody there who knew the issues in great detail. He shadowed the energy brief for 5 years in opposition between 2005 and 2010, and then was the Minister of State for Energy in the Department of Energy and Climate Change for 2.5 years after the 2010 election. He now has an energy-related role for the Prime Minister as the envoy to the Caspian region, the envoy to 3 countries there, so continuing that theme. I first met Charles when he was in opposition, and one thing I was delighted at when he was just appointed after the May election, I was going into the Department of Energy and Climate Change, and he was coming out the other door and came straight over and shook my hand and said hello, and I thought, well, that's a testament to somebody who's been around a long time and remembers the links they made in opposition, because once you're in government, things often change. So without further ado, I really want to introduce Charles. I'm very looking forward to hear what you have to say.
Jim, thank you very much for an extremely kind and generous introduction. I have to say that there were times when I really didn't feel I was an expert at all when I was a minister, most notably when I was sitting in a little radio studio and I was about to go live on BBC Newcastle, and a voice came on the line and said, "We're coming to you next, Sir Richard." And I said, "I'm not Sir Richard." And he rather unhelpfully said, "Well, you should be." And I said, "Who is Sir Richard?" He said, "Sir Richard Mottram is the former permanent secretary at the Home Office who's going live on the Today programme with John Humphreys in 30 seconds to talk about drugs." And so I thought, well, how do my normal lines work? And I thought, well, we are determined to cut emissions, and that could work for some types of drugs, I thought. And then I thought, well, no, our main policy was we were determined to guarantee security of supply at the lowest possible price to consumers. And I realised I was well out of my depth at that point. So, but thank you. It's a great pleasure to be invited here and particularly to be invited to give this first lecture and to talk a bit about some of the challenges we face in UK energy policy. We are at a fascinating time because we need an enormous amount of new investment, but there is confusion about what the different technologies can offer. There's also confusion about how it's going to be paid for and a whole range of different risks which come into that. But the primary job of government in energy policy, I think, is to deliver security of supply. If you haven't got security of supply, you're not going to have low carbon because you'll be burning anything you've got, and you're not going to be affordable. And so security of supply should be the fundamental building block of energy policy. The other aspects are absolutely key as well, but without security of supply, you can't deliver it. And I think we need to look at a range of different aspects of security of supply. There's the one which is most popularly referred to as keeping the lights on. That's a misnomer. People talk about the lights going off in a few years' time. We're not talking about blackouts. We're more realistically talking about brownouts. We're talking about some heavy energy users being asked for a few hours on a few days of the year to come offline. It would be a particularly cold February day when the wind isn't blowing and that there is not enough electricity to meet demand. It's a serious issue. It should be avoided if it can be. But we're not at this stage looking at power cuts to homes. But nevertheless, security of supply is an absolute fundamental part of that. And that means a mix of different aspects. It means base load, So generating huge amounts of power for the base load which is required 24 hours a day, every day of the year. Then you've got variable production coming from renewables, in most cases timings which you can't control, not universally so, but in most cases you have to take it when the wind is blowing, the sun is shining, or the tide is moving. And then what makes up for the difference between the generation which you've got, and so the flexible generation which ensures that you've got enough power being generated to keep the lights on. But the challenge which we face now in that is, with the new building which is required, can it be built in time? When I became a minister, the people were saying, just remember this is only less than 4 years ago, that there was a crunch and it was going to be 2022, 2023. And so we had plenty of time. And then that came forward to 2019. Now people are saying it could be 2016, 2017. National Grid gave a warning indeed for ahead of this winter, which, because it's been very mild, looks unlikely to be a problem. But it is now much closer than people had expected. And the technologies which we're looking at, many of those simply cannot be built in the timescale which is necessary. And therefore that poses a very direct challenge to government and to the policies it puts forward. Then there's resource security. We need to recognise, I think, that your own indigenous resources are inevitably more secure than those which you are importing. And that's why there's an interest in nuclear, why there's an interest in renewables. Nobody can interfere with the generation from those. It's why we need to look, I think, more at greater gas storage. I think that we ought to be having a greater obligation for gas storage, because as we will inevitably become more dependent on imports, even if we can stretch out the life of the North Sea for another 30, 40 years, as I think we can. But if we're going to become more dependent on imports, then storage becomes more important to go alongside it. At the moment, overwhelmingly, our gas comes from countries which are benign and which are reliable. It's Qatar, it's Norway. But increasingly, as a whole range of other countries become gas exporters, then I think that storage issue becomes all the more important. Then there's environmental security. The terrible floods which we're seeing at the moment, I think, will put to bed this issue about mitigation, about the precautionary principle. I've always argued as a politician that if you think there is a 90% chance of something going badly wrong, even if it's a 20% chance of something going badly wrong, then it is beholden on policymakers to put in place the measures which will affect and try to take account of the threat which is coming. And the floods, I think, have meant that it is almost now unanswerable, that argument. There'll be a few people who still suggest it's not necessary. But to my mind, that it is an absolute principle of government that when they can see a significant risk, they must take action to try and diminish the likelihood of that risk happening. I wouldn't put my kids on an aeroplane if I was told that there was a 10% chance of that plane crashing. But yet we are making policies sometimes which don't take account of the fact that 90% plus of the world's scientists tell us that fundamental climate change is happening and that man is responsible for it. So I hope that if there is a benefit which comes out of the terrible scenes which we've seen, is that we will see a fundamental shift in that thinking. And the third part of security is on affordability, and that we need to do all of this in a way that takes account of the consumers. And much of the political debate, much of the front pages of the newspapers, when it talks about energy, is talking about affordability. And it's right that that should be on the agenda. But the risk, I think, at the moment, is by focusing so much on the affordability side, is that the security element, the new investment which is necessary, could be actually overlooked. One of the things I find sort of most disagreeable about the energy debate is that if you try to be recognising we need to attract investment in this country, you try to be supportive of attracting investment, you are automatically portrayed as being anti-consumer and pro-big business. Whereas the reality, actually, is in order to be pro-consumer, in order to have the power coming through that we need, you've got to be pro-business as well. You can't separate those two out. So security is absolutely at the heart of this. As I say, that we are at a critical time, and there's never been greater uncertainty, even though there's a greater need than anything which we need. And I think as we look forward to the choices which we make, we should also just step back for a few years and look at our energy history, because all of the countries around Europe, around the world, their energy history is determined by their resources and who their friends are. And it's who, if you look back to the 1970s, before many of you in this room were born, to the price shocks which happened because of the oil price hikes from Saudi Arabia, that countries reacted in fundamentally different ways to the same external pressure. For Britain, we would have naturally looked towards coal, but coal was becoming unreliable because we had a couple of years of very difficult strikes, and the government was keen to move away from coal, and it coincided with the finds of very large gas resources in the North Sea. And so we saw a dash for gas in the United Kingdom. When you look at why the United Kingdom has been able to meet its Kyoto commitments in a way that few other countries have, it's primarily because of the move to gas, which happened from the 1970s onwards. But France, just across the channel, didn't have gas in the same way, and so it looked towards nuclear. Now, 80% of France's electricity is from nuclear, but that's a program which only started in the 1970s, so it's a relatively recent adoption of nuclear. In Germany, where they, again, didn't have access to gas, they had some nuclear, but nuclear had a totally different connotation in Germany. For us, when people talked about nuclear in terms of defense, it was part of our security. In Germany, when you were between two superpowers and you were the battleground for a potential nuclear war, then nuclear always had very negative connotations to the German population, and understandably so. And therefore, they looked at renewables and how they could harness the renewables which they had. And Denmark, which didn't have many of those, but had a much more catastrophic problem because I understood they said some rather rude things about the Saudis, and they had a rather more serious drop-off in their oil supplies. And therefore, they had to move very quickly, and therefore they became very heavily coal-based, but also looking at district heating schemes, how you could capture the heat. And so when you look at the options which countries have, it's always going to be determined by whether they are resource dependent on imports for their resources, and where they're going to get those from and how they get on with the countries which will be doing that. And part of our energy history as well in this country was the Central Electricity Generating Board. This was an organisation which was populated by people who just loved building things. They built an enormous amount of infrastructure. They were given almost limitless budgets. They had fantastic imagination. And if you want to see the scope of that, go to Snowdonia, to De Norwich, which is like a Bond set, and where inside a mountain that they have carved out the inside of the mountain. There's a reservoir at the top, there's a reservoir at the bottom, and that they just simply, when there's extra electricity in the system, they pump the water up to the top, and they leave it resting on the turbine, so in 16 seconds they can release the power of 2 nuclear power stations. And they do that several times a day. And that was built in 4 years by the CEGB. Now you wouldn't get planning permission in 4 years. And so the infrastructure which we have in this country today is something which is a legacy in many ways of what the CEGB bequeathed to us. But I think that also, though, brings us to part of the current debate. And when the changes which we've seen recently in policy, and people have said we've moved too far away from the market. But my hypothesis is that actually our energy security wasn't delivered by a market. It was delivered by the CEGB. Competition subsequently did deliver cheaper prices. We've had some of the cheapest electricity and gas prices in Europe, and competition brought a real benefit. But it wasn't competition in the market which delivered the security which we've had over years. And I think there's a real reason why we have to question whether a true market could ever deliver it. Because first, that you have to appeal to international companies. Our major energy companies are headquartered in France, in Germany, in Spain. And so that we have to persuade them, rather than going anywhere else where they could allocate their resources, we have to persuade them why they should come to the United Kingdom. They have a choice. They don't have to invest here. And so that the market is flawed from that perspective too. But it also has the problem because I don't think it can deliver the type of investment which we need at the moment. Low carbon investment is lumpy. A nuclear power station, we now know, is many billions of pounds up front and then relatively cheap to run. An offshore wind farm is billions of pounds up front and incredibly cheap to run. And so the markets are not so good at providing the investment where you've got an enormous amount of construction risk before you start to earn any money back. And therefore they need an indication from government. What is the relative importance of security of supply, of affordability, of low carbon as well? And also the markets can't deliver where you've got technologically immature technologies. And so that some of the ones which we're looking at now, ones which have been talked about for so many years, but are now looking as if they can realistically come to fruition, that those are ones where that they will still need government support in order to be able to move towards maturity. So for all of those reasons, that I think that those who argue that we should have a system which is wholly market-based can never actually have it in that same way. And at the end of the day, energy is a policy area which could bring down governments. If we do get power cuts, governments will be thrown out of office. This is something which in this country people quite rightly take for granted, that their lights will stay on. And if in the 2020s that becomes more challenging, governments will fall if they haven't done enough in order to address those issues for the longer term. So when something which has that degree of political importance, then leaving it to other people who might or might not invest, I think is something which is not a possible option. Now, in all of this, so government needs to get involved, therefore, but government has to be careful how far it gets involved. And there's a challenge, I think, which is now facing governments, which is the way in which policy is developed. David Mackay, who's the government's chief scientist in DEC, and who's a brilliant man, when he came into DEC, which was in the last few years of Labour government, he discovered there were over 100 economists in DEC, and there were no engineers. And he made it his task to ensure that we had many more engineers and slightly fewer economists. But we do still need economists, but models are flawed because people don't do as models expect them to do. And I remember the discussions which we had on the solar installations, and Greg Barker and I, who have neighbouring constituencies and with the two ministers of state, and that we would come back in and say, look, the solar is literally not just going on the roof, it's going through the roof. Everybody we talk to is putting on solar panels. And they said, no, they're not. Model says it's not happening. I said, well, everywhere we go in the constituency, people say they're doing it. And I said, pensioners are using their pension pots in order to put solar panels on. No, they won't. They won't live long enough to see it. And the model says they won't do it. And when eventually suddenly this explosion of activity took place, the government had to act incredibly quickly and very unpopularly in order to try and get that back under control. So models can be helpful, but they have to be put into context. And then that takes you through. The model is then used as the basis of the economic impact assessment, which is even more flawed. And I used to find it quite embarrassing when I was expected to say that smart metering will save the consumer £23 a year by 2020. How do we know it wasn't 22? Or what would happen if it was 25? In fact, if it's 23, it is purely by fluke. But we are required by law to do the economic impact assessments, and they take months and months of consultation. It delays policy making, and we do need to find a way of streamlining that process in order to make sure that we can deliver policies rather more quickly. So as government gets involved, then it looks at a whole range of different technologies, and because we are not self-sufficient, then we need to look at a sensible mix. If you are self-sufficient in a resource, like Norway, you will use hydro. If you are self-sufficient in gas, you will probably use gas, but there's even some changes happening in the very gas-rich countries as they move towards renewables as well. And so, but in a country like the United Kingdom, where we're now importing so many sources of our energy and our sources of electricity generation, then we have to look at what is going to be a sensible mix. But all of the technologies which we look at have a drawback. They have a challenge, and I want to just look at a few of those. For nuclear, nuclear should be the lowest cost source of large-scale, low-carbon generation. It's more expensive than people had thought, looking at the cost, which is going to be the case for the new one planned for Somerset. So it is expensive, it is hard to finance, and there is a continuing problem of the waste. We haven't got a resolution in this country for how the waste should be handled, and we do need to find one. That is a political imperative. For gas, we now know the world is awash with gas. By the time when I took on the brief, people were talking about peak gas being around the corner. We now know that there's 200 years supply at least of gas which is going to be available. And new technology of seismic imaging, of horizontal drilling, is making it possible to access resources which would simply not have been possible a few years ago. But it may be abundant, but don't assume it's going to be cheap. Because just as new sources of gas are becoming available, then also gas demand is going to be rising sharply in many countries. Japan moving away from nuclear, Germany moving away from nuclear, the same happening in Italy. And the enormous rates of growth which we would expect to see in Asia and China and India and elsewhere. The demand for gas will be going up as well. And that's why we're right to look at the shale gas option in the United Kingdom. There are real reasons why I don't think it'll be the same here as it's been in the United States. In the States, you own the mineral resource beneath your home. If you have 2,000 acres of North Dakota, you have every incentive in order to extract the gas and to get it to market. But you don't have that same incentive in the United Kingdom. And also in terms of the price, the American gas price is under half of that in Europe. And that's primarily because that gas can't be exported. It will in time be able to be. They're building the LNG facilities. They're going to reverse some of the import facilities. So that will begin to happen. But whereas in the United Kingdom, even if we do find and we can extract very large volumes of gas, then it will be, if there's a price differential between the UK and continental Europe, then the gas will go through those interconnectors until the price balances out in the course of a very few hours. But we're right to explore it, because it could be a significant changing technology, but until we know how much is there, how much we can quantify as being the reserves which are harvestable, then we simply don't know the answers to those questions. And then, of course, there's coal. There is an embargo on building new coal-fired power stations in the United Kingdom unless they have CCS attached to them. Some of the best work in the world is being done at Imperial into CCS. Some of the best work at other British universities, which we should be very proud of. But we don't yet know that it can work, or it can work at what cost. And so until we have the answer to that, there is a big question mark hanging over coal. But one of the extraordinary consequences of the shale gas revolution in the States is that we are now burning more coal in the United Kingdom than we have done for years. Today we're probably 40% probably of our generation is coming from coal. And that's because America is no longer importing coal because of shale gas, and the coal which used to go into the American market is now coming cheaply into the European market, and therefore it's more efficient, it's more cost-effective to burn coal rather than gas. We're even seeing some of the gas plant in this country being mothballed because it's not economic to go on running it. And then with renewables, the challenge for those is their intermittency. But these are some of the ones which I think are most easy to address. And it'll be, again, some of the work which is being done here and things like the Energy Futures Lab and the work in this university, which is going to be transformative in how we deal with those challenges. Because the solution we've got to, where renewables grows up in the course of this decade and the next decade, is when it is able to deliver electricity at the time when people need it, rather than simply at the time when it's available. And that means two things. It means storage, and that we need to find ways in which we can store it. And very exciting work. I think some of the most exciting work in the whole of the energy space is going into storage. Looking at, for example, at liquefied air, of freezing the air to such a position where it becomes liquefied, it becomes a very small size compared to what it used to occupy, and then as you warm it up it expands and you can then turn it back into electricity. It's an infant technology at this stage, but something which could be very, very important as we move forward. And the other one is looking at interconnection, because what we should be doing with renewables is actually harnessing the resources where they're strongest, and we should be then bringing it through modern interconnection to where the demand is going to be. That is the most efficient way of doing it. That's where the cost is going to be lowest. And you can now transport electricity over many, many hundreds of miles with a very fractional loss, just a very few percentage points loss of the electricity over those distances. We've got a connector already of 400 kilometres from Norway to Denmark, 300 kilometres from Australia to Tasmania. And so therefore building one of 1,000 kilometres from Iceland to the UK is something which I think becomes infinitely achievable. And the technology is there, and it's actually not overly expensive, because if you tap into abundant geothermal energy in Iceland, if the people in the government of Iceland are keen to sell it, then it's a cheap resource compared to other sources of generation. So for the challenge for renewables, then there is, I think, a solution which is there in sight. And we should also recognise that the movement towards renewables is global. I get people who write to me and saying, if renewables are so good, why isn't Europe doing it? You can tell the sort of the perspective to which they're coming from. And I say, well, actually, we're third from bottom in the whole of Europe. And they say, well, in that case, why isn't China doing it? And I explained to them that actually in China, 1/3 of the wind turbines in the world last year, 18 gigawatts out of 45, were put in place in China, another 18 gigawatts in America. And the other thing I see is that even in countries like Saudi Arabia needs to be able to keep its own oil for export rather than burning it up for a growing and increasingly energy-hungry population. So they're looking at concentrated solar, they're looking at nuclear. And so low carbon and renewables, even in countries which have abundant sources of their own oil and gas, is going to be an important part of their future going forward. Jim was mentioning that I'm Trade Envoy to Kazakhstan. They want to be a clean economy. They're running the expo there in 2017, and the whole theme about it is clean energy, because they want to portray themselves to the world as a country which is investing heavily in renewables and low-carbon sources of generation. And so that all of those are areas where there are challenges, but for most of them, that there are solutions which are available to them. Now, in terms of how government delivers this, it can first of all do it through signals, it can do it through regulation. So we have laws which set out some of the things which need to happen. We have a 2020 target for renewables, which for the United Kingdom, 15% of all of our energy needs to come from renewable sources by 2020. That means a bit over 30% of our energy, of our electricity, because it also covers heat, it covers transport. Most of us assume that when Tony Blair signed off that treaty, he actually thought he was signing up to it being of our 15% of our electricity. Because my understanding from the officials in BIS and DTI, as it was then the following morning, was one of some horror and shock as to what had been signed up to. But a few years ago, it looked like it would be an unachievable target. But now, we've moved from, in the last 3 years, we've moved from 5% of our electricity coming from renewables to 15% now. It's trebled in that time. So it is absolutely possible to get to 30% of our electricity coming from renewable sources by 2020. It is more challenging to see how we deal with the heat, but we can make good progress. It's more challenging again to see how we deal with the transport. And the only way that we're able to do that is if we actually move to a more electrified system overall, more electric heating, more electric vehicles, more electric trains. But then you need more base load if you're going to be doing that. But it also then helps to manage demand, because your car, your electric vehicle becomes a store of electricity. You can actually download some of the power which you need from it at times of stress in the system. So the framework is coming through there, but regulation is an important part of that. And we also have the legally binding commitment of that we have to reduce our carbon emissions by 80% by 2050 over 1990 levels. So a very tough challenge, one of the toughest in the world, but which other countries have now followed as well. And that every framework of policy has to be seen within those legal obligations. Beyond that, government can give price signals. Now, the funding mechanism which is used, part of that is designed to get over that lumpy nature of investment. It gives a price guarantee over a period of many years for the different technologies. But it also means that government can then say to emerging technologies, it will give them a more generous level of support in order to get them to a position of leadership, to get them to a position of maturity. We've given a very high rate of support to tidal and to marine technologies, because we want the UK to be a global leader. We've got 7,000 miles of coastline. We've got the highest tidal reaches of almost any country in the world. We ought to be global leaders in tidal technology. And by giving a very generous level of support to begin with, it means that people who are looking to develop those technologies should be looking to come to the United Kingdom. So it's a policy that we want an industrial gain alongside an energy gain as well. And it can be used, therefore, to kickstart them. And that's why we've ended up with the market reforms which have recently gone into legislation. I have to say, when we started working on them, we did not think they would look as complicated as they do today. But we realized that for every mechanism which you put in place, it had a side effect somewhere else, and you needed another mechanism in order to do that. So it's the contracts for difference, a sort of feed-in tariff, which will reflect the, go up and down according to where the wholesale price is, which is the main driver for low-carbon investment. But that meant we weren't going to get the investment in new gas, which we need. We've got to have new gas-powered power stations if we're going to get the new generation in place in the timescale that we need it. And therefore, the capacity mechanism is going to be a way of auctioning the new, to bringing that in through an auctioning system so that a new power plant can be built. And there's a carbon floor price, which was there primarily because it was needed for some of the renewable technologies to know what they were going to be, and the low-carbon technologies like nuclear, to know what they were facing in terms of competition from other areas. And it ended up as a complicated series of complicated package. But what's encouraging is that other countries are now saying they're looking at doing the same thing. So it's recognized that in terms of a major market change, it has got some solidity to it. But you have to then add on to that what I'm now seeing in the United Kingdom, which is a degree of political risk. One of the things which I think saddened me most was the extent to which energy has become a real political battleground. I saw it as part of my job to take energy out of politics. I thought it was important that we should have as much all-party support for the policies which were there, because at the end of the day, if you're looking to build a power station which will last for 40 or 60 years, through changes of government, you want to know that there is consistency of policy. And the fact that that has broken down so significantly now is something which I regret. But it's also going to cost all of us money, because the cost of capital has gone up by, people tell me, by 1% typically. So that doesn't sound much. But when we need £100 billion of investment, 1% of an increase in interest on that is £1 billion a year borne by consumers. £1 billion on consumers' bills for no reason at all, apart from that there is political risk associated to the United Kingdom. And that is something which we need to be acutely aware of. And what I hope for this year is we'll start to see, as we get closer to the election, some of those areas of disagreement being resolved, so that we can actually start to offer to investors that long-term political stability, which is so important. The other area which I wanted to touch on briefly before opening up to questions is energy efficiency. That we're in a world now where the solutions to our energy challenges are as much to do with technology as they are to do with finding new resources. And that if you look at the concept of a smart metering, of smart grids, of energy efficiency, all of that is going to be something which changes this outlook, I think almost beyond recognition. I think the great advantage of smart meters is that it changes consumers from being people who will be taking what their energy companies essentially throw at them, to being people who will become able to be people who make decisions about what when they want to use it and how they tap into a certain price. Because we'll find that over time that we will end up, I think by the end of this decade, with significant price differences in the course of the day. And if you want to put your tumble dryer on at the same time as there's a peak of demand across the country because everyone's come home from work and there's a gap in Coronation Street and they put the kettles on, if you want to use it then, you will pay more. But if you want to put it on overnight when there's more space in the system, then you'll pay much less. And it will change the role of consumers dramatically. It's also, we've got to do it. It is the cheapest way of delivering energy security of anything else. It is much quicker. We can start to make real changes in a short period of time, whereas all of the new power stations which we need are ones which will take some years to build. And Greg Barker, my colleague there, to his great credit, has really fought hard to put this at the forefront of DEC's agenda, and I think this is a really important part of the way forward. I just want to say a little word about the future. When you're back here in 20 years' time, I won't be probably back here in 20 years' time, but many of you will be, and you'll look back and say, well, did we make the right choices? At that point, you will be startled by how the world has moved on. And undoubtedly, we can now see coming through the technologies which would be the technologies of choice for the 2030s. Nuclear, I think, will move from huge 1.5 gigawatt reactors to small modular reactors. We'll be seeing solar being much more widespread. Nobody expected the price of solar to come down in the way that it has come down, and it will become one of the most globally significant sources of electricity, even in countries which don't have an enormous amount of sunshine. That we will see changes coming through in a whole range of other technologies which are only just beginning to emerge. The work going on into gasification of waste and creating a syngas which can then be burned cleanly. That all of those are technologies which will be fundamentally transformative. We will, I think, be getting a significant amount of energy and electricity in this country from the tides. They will have reached a point of maturity. Waves will always be more difficult. But that we will look back and think, why did we lock ourselves into those technologies? But it's because we've got to have investment now, and we've therefore got to use the best available technologies. You can always put off investment by saying there's something cheaper, better, quicker, faster, more sophisticated, which is coming around the corner. We don't have that luxury. Time is not on our side in this debate. It's something where we've now got to get that investment coming forward. So I think energy will remain one of the most globally fascinating areas of policy. I've done it for 7 years in opposition and in government, which is longer, I think, than anybody else has ever done the brief. And I find it as fascinating today as when I started. I look at those people who spent their entire careers in the energy sector, who are in their 60s and retiring and wouldn't change anything. They are as excited about the work which they do today as they were when they started 40 years previously. And it's an area where the UK should be leading. Just because we don't have nuclear reactor companies doesn't mean we can't be global leaders in nuclear research in other parts of the nuclear program. We should be global leaders in offshore wind. We should be global leaders in CCS. We should be in tidal. This is a really exciting time, I think, for the world in energy issues. There are massive challenges to be addressed. But it's also one where I think universities like this, organisations like UKirk, the lab here, play a fundamentally important part in enabling to make the most of those opportunities. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. It's been my pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you so much, Charles, for a wide-ranging talk and lots of honest reflections about your time in office as well, which were certainly really interesting insights. I have lots of questions, but I won't ask them. I'm going to pass straight on to the audience. I'll take questions in groups of 2 or 3 if we get that many, and I just ask people to ask questions fairly briefly and identify who they are when they do so. So who's going to be first? We've got 2 next to each other there. So.
Hi, my name is Niall McDowell. I work here at Imperial College. I'd just like to pick up on one of the points you made about CCS and then also think about how that links in with what you mentioned about gas storage in the UK. The first point, you said that we don't know if CCS works. So my comment on that is that every link in the CCS chain has been demonstrated at scale for literally decades, and some aspects of the technology were patented first back in the 1930s. So I would say from a technological perspective, it's all been proven. In Canada, there's a power station that is due to start capturing and injecting CO2 for enhanced oil recovery this year. So then I'd kind of link that back to your comment about large infrastructural projects being delivered by boards or by groups like the CGB as opposed to the market mechanism we have today. And I'd like your comment on that perhaps. And then also, I'm wondering if you see any kind of competition between the potential CCS system or market or whatever in the UK, and also any future expansion of UK gas storage. If you had a comment on that, I'd be very interested as well.
Thank you, and we'll take the second one.
Hi, I'm Matt Hope from Carbon Brief. Thanks very much, that was really interesting. You spoke a little bit early on about energy ministers being risk managers, the risk of affordability, the risk of security, these things being very important. I was just wondering if you could say a few more words on where climate change fits in with this. So where does the risk of climate change and the future risks that come with that fit in terms of the priorities for ministers? And obviously this is a very pertinent debate right now with the floods going on and some of the ministers in their offices at the moment.
Okay, Charles, do you want to take those two and then I'll come
Yeah.
around waiting?
For CCS, I think clearly the bits have been demonstrated and that we haven't got a full commercial scale plant operating anywhere in the world. I think the one in Canada, let me talk about that afterwards perhaps if I'm misinformed on that. What we don't know is how much of the power plant you lose in order to operate the CCS system. So there are technological challenges which are still there. The biggest challenge, I think, is the cost at which it can be done and whether it's economically viable to do it. We all hope that it can be, and we all hope that it can be an important part of the mix going forward. I don't see how we can deal with climate change globally if we can't get CCS. I don't think that every prediction which I've seen going out to 2050 relies on an enormous amount of coal and gas in the mix in order to meet rising energy demand across the world. And that therefore we have got to find a way in which CCS works. And so there is a political imperative in there in spite of the questions. I don't see it as a conflict with more gas storage. One of the changes we made was to, one of the pilot projects for CCS would be on a gas plant. We see gas an important part of that. I mean, storage, I think, is a very separate issue, just in terms of the requirement for making sure that we've got more supply than we've had historically. Last winter, we were within hours of running out of gas, and that it was because the winter went on for so much longer. It was, when I was a minister, every morning during the winter, I would have a report on where we were in terms of storage, how much our storage had gone down. And it was quite scary, because I realised that if we ran out of gas, I would be sacked. That I hadn't realised I was going to be sacked anyway, but I think gas storage is a different issue. The question on climate change, I think the debate has just moved on because of the floods. I think that now that we have seen this in such a traumatic way, and the heaviest rainfall and the worst flooding for 200 and something years in the United Kingdom, the coldest winter in the United States, the hottest summer in Australia, extremes all around the world. And so something of such enormous magnitude is happening that we can't turn our minds away from it. You can have a debate about whether man is responsible for it or not, but I don't think there's a debate now about whether it's actually happening. And therefore, we must show leadership. We can't expect countries like China and India to be showing leadership if we're not prepared to do so. And so I think that debate has moved on significantly.
Thank you. I've got three questions near the front. The first one's here. We'll go to the next round. So there's one there and then one over here. So I'll take those. So you first.
Should I just shout?
No, you've got a mic now.
Sorry. Hi, my name's Lizzie Lunn. I'm from the EIC. My question is, in the event of Scottish independence, we've got the referendum later on this year, if they do become independent, what impact will that have on UK energy policy and us reaching our targets? Obviously, Scotland's a massive hub for our energy supply, and I just wanted your thoughts on that, please.
Thank you. One here.
Yes, thank you. John Best from James Fisher. I'd be interested in your view, Charles, on UK content, which is a continual theme. I noted when you said we had to persuade countries like Spain, Germany, Norway, etc., to invest in this country. How do we encourage them to look at UK content?
Thank you. And a third one just over here.
Hello, Charles. It's Mark Petterson. I'm a Imperial alumni, and as Charles mentioned earlier, 30 plus years in the industry, still loving every moment of it, and lots of challenges. One of the biggest ones facing UK is the current EMR process. You mentioned earlier it's more complicated than people imagined. There's this huge amount of nervousness in the sector. I think a lot of projects are slipping sideways because of people don't have the visibility of the details. Will it be a car crash, or will they get through it?
Thank you. Let's pick up on Mark. I mean, you were mostly good-humoured, was my recollection, although I think you didn't seem to enjoy it quite so much when you were waiting for a long time for a planning consent on Dudgeon to be decided upon. But inevitably, when you go through a period of change, then that there is some uncertainty which comes with it. It's called the certainty paradox, and which is that in order to have certainty, you have to have uncertainty first. So we've gone through the process of creating uncertainty, and now the certainty can be delivered. People now know the long-term nature of the regime. They know the funding pot out to 2020. So people can make decisions about taking projects forward in the knowledge of that. There is not enough money there for all the projects which people want to take forward. And so that we need to see more work being put into bringing the cost down. That we need to, offshore wind, for example, we need to get that down closer to £100 a megawatt hour, so it's much more cost competitive. And so I think that there's a short-term hiatus, but in many areas that we've still got a good good investment stream which is coming through. And I think that links through to John's question, because I think UK content in these areas is crucial, because I don't think we can sell the British population an offshore wind policy if it's built mostly by overseas companies, which may repatriate the profit, and if the jobs go abroad as well, and it's a higher cost of generating electricity than others which would be available. I don't think there is any benefit to the UK consumer unless that there is UK content there. And what I want to see in the UK is I want to see us manufacturing the turbines. I want Siemens to come to Humberside. I want in your own area in East Anglia to see a renaissance there. And so this often brings fantastic jobs to areas which have been in long-term decline, some of our historic ports. And so there's a very close tie-in there between energy policy and industry policy, and that it should absolutely be an important government objective. I'm chairing a group for Ed Davey, a cross-party group, to try and get more UK content in the oil and gas industry. And what we're doing is we just call in the companies and we ask them what they're doing. We have no powers, we have no legal powers, but they don't like being called in. And now, whereas before they'd come in and make a strong defence of what they're doing, now they're coming in and saying, oh, we've got these companies on our tender list. And it is changing their thinking, because there's a group of people, and there was a decision for the Alderfield, where almost all of that is coming to the United Kingdom. Hundreds of millions of pounds of investment in the United Kingdom is coming to that, and we're told that part of the reason for that is because our group just kept on questioning them. So this should be a really important objective. And finally, on Scotland, if Scotland was to vote for independence, then there would be a new renewables target, which would be separate for Scotland and separate for the remaining parts of the UK, so that ours would drop, Scotland's would go up. I cannot conceive that there would be any going back on the agreements which have been put in place so far, whereby the costs of Scottish renewables are spread across the whole consumer base of the United Kingdom. I can't believe that would be torn up, because I think that would be making retrospective changes like that, even when a country has chosen to have its independence, would be unthinkable. But what I think would then become an issue is whether that would continue to be the case for new developments in Scotland. And then the companies, I think, and the supply companies would be deciding, do we want to buy more French nuclear, or do we want to buy wind from Ireland, potentially, which could be developed there, or do we want to buy it from an interconnector from Iceland, or do we want to buy Scottish renewable electricity? And so the future becomes more challenging. But nobody should ever suggest that a small country like Scotland couldn't run an energy policy. Norway, as 4 or 5 million people, runs a fantastically successful energy policy. I'm not advocating independence, but don't take it for what I'm saying, that I have any doubts that a Scottish government couldn't run a successful energy policy.
Thank you. Jim Ski, just in the back there.
Yeah, Jim Ski from Imperial College. I wanted to ask a question about the link between UK and EU energy policy with sort of two dimensions to it. I mean, the UK was always seen as leading the liberalisation charge in Europe, but now there are a lot of concerns in Brussels about what it sees as the renationalisation of policy, with Britain and Germany leading the charge, and a perception that the UK may sort of be doing a kind of U-turn on the liberalisation agenda with aspects of EMR, etc. And the second part of it is what you think about the idea of a renewables energy target as part of the 2030 package, which of course the Commission has come up with an uneasy compromise between an EU target but nothing delegated to the Member States.
Question just here, I think. And then I'll come to you, Jane, and then here for the third.
Charles, is that switched on? Following on from that, first of all, Claire Durkin, thank you very much. As comprehensive and wise as ever. It's following on from that because I wanted to ask you about interconnectors, which you mentioned, and a single energy market in Europe, both of which are as fundamental to our energy of supply, security of supply, as the generation. But they're not as exciting. They're never going to be number one on ministers' agenda. They're certainly not going to be on the Daily Mail agenda. But they're enormously important, enormously exciting. And we did really, really lead the world on grids, not just say that we ought. And we do wonderful interconnectors. I do agree that we can get all the way to Iceland. We could lead, and we had led, as Jim said, in terms of a single market in energy, but we have yet to get anywhere on that. And we are in danger of Gazprom tying us all up. And we don't have that single market pool in gas and electricity. I really want to invite you to bring some words of wisdom on the engineering of it for Imperial, but on leadership, as you've been talking about in terms of nationally, and the importance of it in terms of investment and how you get your colleagues to get excited about the interconnection of energy.
Julian O'Halloran, BBC Current Affairs. In November 2012, when launching the government's energy efficiency strategy, Ed Davey, the Secretary of State, said in his foreword that, and I summarise, if Britain did the right things about energy efficiency, carried out the right policies, we could get rid of the need for 22 power stations. I assume he meant, approximately 1,000 megawatts power stations, an awful lot, more than 10% of demand. Do people in DEC believe that? Do you believe that? And if that is the case, why is progress towards this aim still rather at snail's pace? We don't hear the drum being banged very much on it, despite the kind words you had for Greg Barker and his commitment to energy efficiency and cutting back demand.
Thank you. Well, let me immediately begin by extending my warm words to Ed Davey as well. I wasn't being partisan in my comments. I hugely enjoyed working for Ed and indeed for Chris Hume, who I thought was one of the most stimulating and challenging and intellectually brilliant people I've ever known. Within the programme, that there is an increasing recognition that energy efficiency can make a big difference. We look at though what's happening, and still 40% of houses in the United Kingdom don't have effective loft insulation, and you get a payback for that in a little over a year. So when people can get a payback that quickly, why are they not doing it? So you need some nudge. You need something like the Green Deal to give the assessments to people's homes. Even if people don't take up the Green Deal finance, at least they're still taking it forward in other ways, having had a comprehensive assessment of their homes. Then you need some areas which are incentives. So you offer some financial support, or the energy company obligation, and where the energy companies, I think Centrica had an almost shop your granny policy, where saying people find somebody who needs some insulation and we'll do it for them for free. So that, again, that was sort of helping to roll that through. And then, if necessary, use the stick, which is saying that, for example, in the private rented sector, that if they don't bring it up to standard, then you will not be allowed after 2017-18 to rent out a house which hasn't been brought up to that standard. So you can drive it through a range of different mechanisms. But the other thing which will change is where it moves on to a very big scale, which is going to be through, I think, the capacity mechanism, because the capacity mechanism can be used not just for an auction which will bring in new generation, but it can also be used for systems which will take demand out of the system. This is the negawatts concept from the States. And that's where I think it becomes really exciting. And you'll find a whole range of companies being set up which will help people, businesses in particular, in order for how they will manage that better. So, and if we can obviate the need for building power stations at many billions of pounds of costs, then that is a big saving to the consumer. So everybody wins from this. And it's something which is a very good industrial policy because the jobs are automatically here in the United Kingdom for doing it. On the two questions on the EU, energy is not an EU competence. Energy is a domestic competence. We still have an energy commissioner. We still have actually very useful discussions, but they have very limited powers for what they can deliver. I think one of the most important things the EU has done has been to help provide greater energy security across Europe. The putting in place of new infrastructure, ensuring that countries can't be isolated in the way that they were historically, ensuring that if there was an interruption of supply, then that they're still going to get that gas from somewhere else or electricity from somewhere else. That's the sort of overview which they've taken for that has been, I think, one of the most important bits of work which they've done. We have less interconnection than most European countries because we are an island. If you're putting it between Germany and Belgium, it's really quite straightforward. Here it's obviously more complicated, but we do need to catch up. And I think that this is a very exciting area of policy. You say it doesn't excite the Daily Mail. I've always think it's a bad thing to excite the Daily Mail because they tend to get excited about the wrong things, I feel. But I think that this is such a game changer that it means that we are no longer an island. Now, a lot of my colleagues will be rather nervous to be told that, but I think that the idea that we will live in an increasingly interconnected world, and there is no reason why you can't have an offshore grid for Northern Europe, which harnesses the offshore wind facilities, and then you have a solar grid in the Mediterranean bringing in solar power into the southern grid. And we need to look at these things more holistically. The EU is the only forum we have for taking that forward, and so it does do good and important work in that area, and I think there's growing recognition of that. And Jim, on your issues there, we still want to see more energy companies in the United Kingdom. We still want to see greater liberalisation. There's been too much concentration in too small a number of companies, I think. I wouldn't go as far as stopping them being vertically integrated, but frankly, I don't know why they want to be vertically integrated. If you're making a bit of money out of generating, why do you want to have millions of customers who hate you? So I think we'll see that separating over time, but I don't think it will need to be forced by government or by Europe in order to make it happen. As a renewables target for 2030, personally I don't support it because I think that renewables should be part of a low carbon objective. Renewables is not an objective separate from low carbon, it is part of low carbon. And therefore we should be looking at low carbon, decarbonisation, as being the great need which we have. And whether that's through nuclear or renewables, that should be left up to individual member states to do. I do think that the way in which they've taken it forward of an EU-wide target is utterly ineffective because one of the changes which I hope we made coming into government was we didn't have any targets, we didn't have roadmaps. Indeed, it should be the law that you can't have a target if you haven't got a roadmap, because politicians like setting targets. But if you don't know how you're actually supposed to deliver it, it's meaningless. We inherited a target that fuel poverty would be abolished on the 22nd of November 2016 in England and a year later in Scotland. We're nowhere near it because nobody had a strategy for how it was going to be done. There's one now being developed. And so that just putting in place some nice sounding words, inevitably all it does is it stokes up a problem for your successor but for to have to explain away when you're not going to meet it in some years to come. So let's have a strategy, let's have a programme for how we're going to deliver decarbonisation. Let's be sort of clear about that, and the roadmaps which the government has done has been an important part of that. But some meaningless general target I don't think will deliver much.
Thank you. Well, with apologies to those people in the queue, I think given our hour is up, I think we should stop there. Charles, if you're happy to join us for a drink afterwards, then perhaps people can catch Charles over a glass of wine. I mean, that was, again, thanks again for such a wide-ranging and fantastic speech and some of the views you've given and the insights. I mean, what stays with me is the passion you still have after 7 years in this business. Some of those comments, particularly why would you need to be vertically integrated, I'll try that one out next time I meet a senior executive from the Big Six. And when I next meet somebody who runs models and impact assessments in DEC, I shall be intrigued about what's the real discussion we might have about reality versus the model. Well, it's something we have actually in Newkirk as well. So thank you again very much. Please join me in thanking Charles in the moment.